So we got a perfect storm in the markets right now. We're going to discuss why this storm's not going away anytime soon. So what we're going to take a look at today is sort of a big picture, 30,000 foot view of the economy and the markets in general. And what I like to say is we basically got the perfect storm going on with the economy right now and the markets. And I use the word the perfect storm. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie The Perfect Storm. But the book by Sebastian Junger is phenomenal. It's one of my favorite books of all time. And it's about the 1992 perfect storm. And that's where we had a hurricane come from the south and then two other low pressure systems come together. So you had three really low pressure systems all colliding together just to create a monstrosity of a storm. And I think we're kind of seeing that happen right now in the world. I think this is something that is basically kind of a game changer for the economy overall. And, it's something that we're just going to dig into a little bit here. Now, I did a presentation a little while ago. You could probably find it on my YouTube channel where I just talked about sort of the four horsemen of the stock market, things that typically aren't good for the stock market. So valuations, interest rates, inflation rising, and the dollar rising or getting stronger. And a lot of that's playing into my perfect storm, the three fronts coming together. But this is still in place for the U.S. stock market. But I'm looking again at a 30,000 foot view here. I'm not so much focused on just short-term market moves. What I'm looking at is we have three things in place all coming together at the same time. And it's going to create a real storm here. The first one is valuations. So valuations of asset classes across the board are at all-time highs. World dynamics is another thing that's starting to play out. It's not just the situation in the Ukraine, but really a broader perspective. It's certainly the Russia-Europe issue is one of them, but there's also the U.S. and China, but we'll talk about that in a second. And then finally, we're finally getting to the point where we're starting to see a sovereign debt crisis, where in 2008, for instance, we had a banking crisis that essentially was the issue. Now we're getting to the point where the actual governments are facing some real serious situations. So that's sort of what the perfect storm is. And when you take those three things and they merge together, what you basically end up with, and I've got it there in the middle, it's a financial shit show. So that's what I think we're heading into. I've already started to head into, but I think it might get a little bit worse from here. Now, before we get into the specifics of everything, I just want to give you kind of a rundown of the history so you kind of understand how this developed. Now, in 1944, there was a Bretton Woods conference, and essentially what that did is it established the US dollar as the international medium of exchange. And the dollar at that time was backed by gold. So essentially the world was on a gold standard. Then in 1971, Nixon took us off the gold standard. All of our spending on Vietnam and then some of the social programs that we had in place was really crushing the budget. And what forced Nixon to do this was the French were literally handing dollars into us and demanding that we pay them out in gold. So we were finding out we'd be short gold if we didn't do this. So that's why Nixon took us off. And then what happened shortly thereafter of Nixon taking us off the gold standard, we had the Basel Accord. The first one, there's been three of them now, but the first Basel Accord essentially set a new policy with the dollar still as the medium of exchange in international transactions, but it was not going to be backed by gold. And that's pretty important. So just to give you an idea of how the system operates. I mean, right now the United States comprises about 24% of the world's economic activity. So all of the GDPs of all the countries around the world, we're about 24% of that. And that's pretty impressive when you figure we're only 5% of the population. So that's a pretty impressive factor for the United States. Now the thing is, though, the dollar is used in 85% of the world's transactions. So even though we're not, that big as far as economic activity, countries are still forced to use the dollar. And the thing is, the dollar now is such that it isn't something that people or that countries have to come into the United States to get dollars. There's something called the euro dollar market. And it has nothing to do with the Europe or the euro. It's basically just offshore dollars. It's the offshore dollar system. So a lot of countries will trade between each other and then pay out using this euro dollar system. It's a critical factor in what's going on today. I'm not going to get too much into that right now. Maybe that'll be a future video. But just to give you an idea, again, let's say Brazil is going to sell some oil to India. So what they're going to do is Brazil obviously would provide India with the oil, and then India would have to pay in US dollars. So India wouldn't pay in the rupees, which is the Indian currency, and India has no use for the Brazilian real. So those two currencies can't be used in this transaction. It has to be dollars. So they have got to figure out a way to get those dollars to pay each other. So no matter pretty much any country that's dealing with another country right now, they're transacting in US dollars. And shortly after we had the first Basel Accord, the Treasury of the Secretary at the time, John Connolly, this famous quote, he said, "The US dollar is our currency, but your problem." So that's sort of what he was telling the other countries. And it's absolutely true. They're really struggling right now with the strengthening dollar. Now, if you want to learn a little bit more about euro dollars and how that offshore dollar market works, there's a really good site called Euro Dollar University. These guys are great. Jeff Snyder, Emil Kalinowski. I've learned a ton from them, but you'll start to see that everything revolves around the dollar, and it's getting to be a problem for the world. Okay, so one of the storms that I said that's sort of coming in is valuations. Again, valuations on every asset class we have is at historical highs. And valuations don't tell you anything about what's going to happen in the near term as far as what the market's going to do going up or going down. Valuations kind of give you a longer term or mid-term understanding of what kind of return you're going to get for investing at higher valuations. But the biggest problem we have right now with record high valuations is when asset classes are so richly valued that it's almost like it's brush fire in a forest, just laying out there. So when a fire starts, if you have a lot more brush out there, the fire is going to go insane. And that's kind of what happens with high valuations right now. If you've got those extra brush out there, if you have a market downturn, the market downturn is a lot more severe when asset classes are at all-time highs. And I'll show you real quick a couple of the stock market, U.S. stock market. It's basically hit levels that we have never seen before. This is the Q ratio. This slide is a bit dated, and it has come down a little bit due to the decline in the stock market in 2022. But still, you can see we reached a record high valuation based on the Q ratio. And then this is Buffett's favorite valuation metric. It's the market capitalization of all the publicly traded companies divided by our gross domestic product, or the size of our economy. Here again, you can see we dwarf the financial crisis and the dot-com crisis and have reached levels we've never reached before. And even on price to sales, in this graph, the orange line is the price to sales. The blue line is the S&P 500. we've hit a level. The amount that you're paying for a stock relative to its sales has never been higher, and it's just not a good thing. But it's not just stocks. Again, I'm talking all asset classes. Looking at bonds, this is the federal funds rate. This is the short-term rate that the Federal Reserve controls, and you can see we've been zero bound really since about 2008, late 2008, early 2009. So bonds have basically come down as low as they possibly can as far as yields. So, the bull market that started way back in 1981 in bonds, as the bond yields came down, it's pretty much at its end. And at this point, you have an extremely overvalued bond market. So stocks, bonds, and even now real estate is also at ridiculously high valuations. It's now the highest valuation when you compare the average new home price divided by disposable personal income. So it takes 9.5 times your income to buy a house today, the average house. Again, higher than it was in any previous period, including the housing bubble back in 2006. A lot of people will argue that, hey, we're not going to see a downturn in housing because what happened in 2006 was all these, interest-only loans or negative amortization loans where you weren't even paying all the interest back. These ninja, no income, no job applications, all this kind of crazy stuff. And it's true that was some brush for the eventual fire. But at the end of the day, it all comes down to how much are you paying for that house relative to the income you earn. That's the key factor. And maybe when interest rates were really low, we could get away with paying more for a house because the interest expense on the mortgage wasn't too bad. But that's gone. I mean, those sub 3% mortgages right now are a thing of the past. They certainly could come back. If we have a recession, I expect interest rates to come back down. But at least right now, you're looking at well over 6%, even in the 7% right now. This chart is showing you the mortgage rates from 9/26 of this year, of 2022, and it had 30-year fix at 6.8. Even since then, and I'm recording this on October 3rd, even a week later, it's at 7.02% for mortgage rates. So sub 3%, maybe we could pay 9.5 times our income for a house. At 7%, it just doesn't make sense. And at the end of the day, what that means is home prices, if rates stay where they're at, home prices are going to have to come back. And just to clarify a little bit more what the real impact on that is, if you take a 30-year mortgage, say $600,000 on a home at 2.6% interest rate just last year in 2021, today you'd have to buy a house that's only $392 to keep the same mortgage payment, and that's at 6.2% interest. We're already, again, like I mentioned, just over 7. So prices have to come back in homes. I mean, this is the valuations on it. Yeah, I bet you're thinking you need a shot of Jack Daniels right about now, don't you? So again, valuations is the first of that perfect storm, that first low front in that perfect storm. And the reason I bring that up again, if things go bad when you're at high valuations, the downside is much worse because, again, think brush fire. You got lots of brush out there. You have a forest fire. That brush is going to create just a really raging inferno. So the second front in all this is a sovereign debt crisis. We're finally getting to the point where it's going to start to hit the governments. They're going to start bumping up against the wall. I'm going to focus a little bit here just on the U.S., but it's really across the board on all the developed countries. This is a chart of the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. It goes all the way back to 2007. And kind of what you can see here is we had a Fed balance sheet. So this is assets that the Federal Reserve holds. For decades, it was about $800 billion, and it was all treasuries. I could show a graph from 2007, probably back to maybe the 1970s, and it would be about $800 billion all of treasuries. But when '08 happened, what the Federal Reserve was doing was they started purchasing assets. They printed money to purchase assets from the bank to liquefy the bank. So the banks were able to give these horrible mortgage products that they have on their books to the Federal Reserve, and then they got a fresh infusion of cash. And it's not just banks that go to the Fed. There's also some private equity, some other bigger players out there that can get access to the Fed balance sheet. So they give the bad assets to the Fed, get some clean capital, makes them look good. And what happened with that clean capital is it found its way into different asset prices, stocks, bonds, real estate. But it didn't really manifest itself into price inflation that you and I experience when we go to the grocery store or the gas pump. Because it didn't come directly to us. It just went to the financial intermediaries. It made it to asset, so we had asset inflation, but we didn't have price inflation. Well, this last little bit here from COVID, when the money was just being printed and pumped in straight to us, PPP loans, unemployment, all of these, the $1,000, stimulus payments, all this stuff got into our hands. So you had more dollars chasing the same amount of goods and services. That creates price inflation. And then couple that with really a destructed supply chain, which I'll talk about a little bit later. You've got a real backstop for inflation. And that's what the Fed is facing right now. So the Fed really only has two ways that it can stimulate or pull back on the economy. The first one is their federal funds rate. So obviously the lower they go in Fed funds rate, the more incentive there is for people to borrow money and get the economy moving. But they took that basically down to 0%, and now they're pulling it back up recently. But the other one is this quantitative easing. So again, everywhere you see on this chart, the QE1, QE2, QE3, 4, that's where they were printing money, providing it out to the economy, and then taking assets in from banks or other intermediaries. So those are the two ways that they've been doing it, and they've been doing it a ton. Yeah, you can see, since '07, we've had 5 quantitative easing programs by the Federal Reserve, and it never hurt them in the past. It was almost a playbook for them that when anything bad was happening in the markets, the Fed would start another quantitative easing and make sure that they had their interest rate at close to 0%. So they would just take rates low and then start purchasing more assets. So they were able to do this, and the thing is, we still kept under 2% inflation. So the Fed thought they had this thing figured out. Anytime there's any kind of financial strife, we'll just print money, drop the rate to 0, and everything will work out because we're not getting inflation. And then just this year, we started to see some serious inflation. Now the Fed has got to fight inflation. The Federal Reserve has 2 mandates. One is stable prices, and 2 is full employment. We're doing fine on the employment side, but we're obviously hurting stable prices. So that's what they're doing. They're trying to attack that in order to bring more stable prices to consumers. And you have to remember, the average American has less than $1,000 in their bank account. So, when you're worried about maybe stocks dropping or bonds losing value or home prices coming down, just remember there's a lot of people who don't even have hardly anything in their bank account. So this inflation is absolutely ravaging them. I mean, they're making decisions about not feeding their family, not heating their house, that kind of stuff. So the Fed has a bigger incentive to get this inflation under control than they do to keep the markets propped up. That's a huge point to think about. With the other central banks around the world, their number one mandate, stable prices. They don't have the full employment like our Federal Reserve does. Other central banks are looking at stable prices, and they're all having problems. So the thing is, we're at a point now where not just the United States, but all these governments are facing just such massive debt loads that we're getting to where they really can't afford to have higher interest rates because we can't afford it. But yet if they don't have higher interest rates and start to pull some money out of the economies, we're going to have ravaging inflation. So I think we're now at that point where it's either going to be inflation, they're going to inflate away the debts, or they're going to start to probably in some way sort of default on them. And it's going to depend on the country. This chart shows you our federal debt as it's grown all the way back from the 60s until today. And right now, the U.S. public debt is 130% of our gross domestic product. So that's for every dollar of economic activity we have $1.30 of debt. And then annual deficits, you can see they're only getting bigger year to year. So obviously 2020 was a huge year due to COVID, but 2021 was just as big. And the thing is, 2022 is on par to do it yet again. This is a breakdown of our government budget, so you can kind of understand what's going on here. We bring in about $2.5 trillion in income tax revenue, another $2 trillion of Social Security, Medicare tax revenue, so about $4.5 trillion total. The benefits we're paying out right now for Social Security and Medicare is about $2 trillion. And then other government spending is about $4 trillion. So we have about $6 trillion total spending today with $4.5 trillion of tax revenue. So that's a $1.5 trillion deficit every single year. And that's just right now. That's projection right now based from Congressional Budget Office. The thing that should alarm you is the fact that we're starting to get to the point where we're going to run into other shortfalls and other tax issues that really going to hurt. The first one is Medicare and Social Security. So Medicare is projected to run out of their surplus or their trust fund in 2028. And right now, Social Security is saying 2037, but I've seen it as early as 2030. So at that point, the trust fund is spent down. In the case of Medicare, they say they'll be able to cover 90% of the expenses, and Social Security will only be able to cover 75% of the expenses. So, if they do nothing, if Congress does nothing, everybody's looking at a 10% cut in Medicare coverage and 25% in Social Security. That's what it's looking at. The disability insurance program seems to be pretty solid, so that's not really going to be a problem, at least until we're all dead, after 2100. But the scary thing is, this is not looking at a lot of the unfunded liabilities that we have. So a typical pension manager, what they do is they look at the assets they have on hand and they try to determine what allocation do we need to have, what kind of return do we need to get to cover all of our liabilities for the foreseeable future. So they're looking at all liabilities, all outflows. Social Security, Medicare, they only look at the current year. They're not looking at future. There's no funding going on. There's nothing happening to cover any unfunded liabilities, any future liabilities, beyond the 1 year mark. And it's a massive amount. We have massive unfunded liabilities from Social Security, for Medicare, for state budgets. State pensions are way underfunded. So when you start to put all of those in there, the future expenses are just looking astronomical for us. So right now, total U.S. debt, this is individual, corporation, and government debt, is about $90 trillion. U.S. unfunded liabilities is $169 trillion. So think about that. So all the debt we have today is barely 50% of unfunded liabilities over the next 30 years. So the total is $259 trillion. And if you were to take every asset within the United States, real estate, stocks, bonds, it's about $193 trillion. So we have a shortfall of about $66 trillion. to cover our unfunded liabilities, and that's just not going to happen. And the thing is, that's really going to get us is we're getting to the point when, as interest rates go up, the cost to service our current debt also goes up. It goes up precipitously. In fact, I'm going to show you a video right now that basically Stan Druckenmiller is talking at a CNBC forum, and he discusses how much our interest on our debt is going to take up our spending over the next 20, 30 years.
There was a time you went to college campuses and you talked about an equity and debt. I think in this case it wasn't necessarily Fed-induced, but it was entitlement-induced. Yeah. And it could come, this was 10 years ago, and I think you said sometime between, Nostradamus. You said 2020 and 2035.
Yeah.
So it's is it 2022? Is it happening?
We are in deep trouble. So everything I said at those colleges is worse in terms of the metrics, except for one thing. And what I miscalculated was I didn't calculate zero rates, I used 4% rates. But the only thing Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton agreed on in 2016 was don't cut Social Security, don't cut entitlements. So nothing was done. Joe Biden has excoriated Rick Scott because he dared mention maybe we shouldn't be increasing senior pays. But if you look at the reversal I just talked about, and you use the CBO estimate, which is rates at 3.8%, which I think frankly is pretty optimistic, given all the things we've talked about. By 2027, the interest expense alone on the debt eats all healthcare spending. By 2047, it eats all discretionary spending. So we're now getting into fiscal dominance. By the way, by 49, it eats all Social Security. We're getting to the point now where the interest expense on the debt is so high that it's going to eat up our ability to basically service the next generation. I'm not even sure about the current one.
Okay.
I brought some cyanide if you'd like one.
No, I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking maybe we'll be okay, but
yeah, because we'll be dead.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Okay, so you can see we've got massive amounts of unfunded liabilities, and we have an interest expense that's going to be taking up more and more of our tax revenue just to cover interest expense. That's not even services for anybody. And the thing is, we're not alone here. We're not alone here. All of the developed world markets are facing the same thing. Japan, all throughout Europe, China, they're in the same exact boat. So we have this massive amount of debt that's taking up more and more of our tax revenue. We have unfunded liabilities, all countries, not just the U.S. And now we have inflation that's starting to manifest itself. And this shows you, we've got inflation rate for many countries 8% or north of that. So central banks are now in a conundrum because if they're supposed to control inflation, the number one way that they control inflation is to raise interest rates. So they raise interest rates, that pulls money out of the economies, makes people a little bit less willing to borrow. It slows down the amount of money that's out there, pulls inflation down. So if they raise interest rates, though, they've got so much debt that they have to service. The interest expense is just going to go parabolic. So we've got that sort of conundrum happening right now. What do? Do they address the inflation? Which, if they don't, they're going to have very angry populations. People are going to be very angry with the government if they continually see, north of 8% annual growth on their expenses, on their living expenses. They can't keep up with that. But on the other hand, you're going to start to see some serious issues in the debt markets if they can't pay the interest on the debt. And then the rest of the world's problem, going back to, it's our currency, but it's your problem. right now the US dollar, because liquidity is drying up in the markets, the US dollar is getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And you can see this is the US dollar compared to Canadian, Australian, the euro, British pound, and Japanese yen. They're all struggling. And it's not just those countries. This is the Chinese yuan. It's losing value rapidly relative to the US dollar. And the yuan is technically tied to the US dollar, but it's still facing a situation where it's losing value relative to ours. This is a chart of a basket of securities in Asian countries divided by the US dollar. It's dropping like a rock. And this is the Indian rupee. This isn't divided by the US dollar, so you can just see the rupee is basically losing value as well. And then internationally, like I mentioned, it's not just us that's facing higher interest rates. This shows you, some of the major markets in Europe. Their 10 years are exploding higher. So all of these countries are facing much higher interest expenses. And what happened last week in England is probably going to be endemic of what's going to happen around the world. I don't know if you follow this much, but basically the British pound and the British 10-year, their treasury, which they call gilts, we had a situation. So a lot of the pension funds in the UK are mandated to hold a certain percentage of government bonds, just as they are here in the United States. They're trying to protect the safety of the pension by having government bonds in there. Well, the problem was the 10-year gilts were losing money so fast that a lot of the pension funds in the UK went to their central bank, the UK central bank, the Bank of England, and said, hey, we're going to go bust here. We're losing tons of money, and with these interest rates going up, we're in trouble. So all of a sudden, the Bank of England was in quite the conundrum. So they were trying to basically raise interest rates and stem the inflation that's taking place in the UK. But what ended up happening, because of this, they had to stop with their tightening and they started easing again. They started buying the 10-year gilts. They started buying those bonds to try to bring the price back down, the yields back down, to protect the pension funds. But once they did that, this is what happened to the British pound. It dropped like a rock. So the currency got hammered when they stepped in to protect the bonds. So we basically have a situation now where central banks around the world are going to have to either protect their currency and manage inflation or protect their bond market. And what we saw from the Bank of England was they were first trying to manage inflation and strengthen the pound to cure inflation, but then bonds got too much in trouble. So they squeezed over here to try to fix the bond, but just like a balloon, the air all went over here. So now they're gonna have inflation because the pound's dropping like a rock. So if they then try to address that again and stem inflation a little bit, it's going to go back to the bonds. They're in this part where no matter what they do, they're in trouble. And I think what's probably going to happen over the next few years, maybe, all the central banks around the world are going to let inflation run and then do something to fix that, and then the bond market will be in trouble. They'll try to fix that. They're just going to go back and forth. It's like they're going to run over one side of the wall and put their finger in the dike there to stop the water from coming in, and then when it's coming in too hard over here, they'll run over the other side of the room and put their finger in the dike over there, and it's just going to be back and forth. But at the end of the day, I think we've gotten to the point where big decisions are going to have to be made. We're either going to let inflation run wild so that the bond market can survive, or they're going to have to in some way default, and every country is going to be a little different. There's no way I can tell how this thing's going to really play out or when it's going to play out. But that's really the only way out for a lot of these central banks. It's one of these things, it's a doom loop, So right now, a lot of countries, especially like Japan and China, they have built up a war chest of money because they are huge exporters. So for instance, both China and Japan export more goods to us than we export to them. So they have a trade surplus. That trade surplus, essentially they bought U.S. treasuries with it. So they're sitting on U.S. treasuries or other assets. They might buy gold, they might buy some stocks. But what we have happening now, in order to save their currency, they've had to sell their U.S. treasuries in order to fix their currency. In order to save their currency, they sell treasuries. But the problem is when they do that, the U.S. dollar strengthens, which means they have to sell more U.S. treasuries to protect their currency. And it's just this loop that's going to continue to go on. So it's a real situation that we have right now. So those are the two big things. We got high valuations already, and then we throw in there the fact that we're finally kind of at the end game for central banks regarding debt and inflation. Now, a lot of people might say, okay, well, what if the supply chains come back online? What if, those things happen and inflation naturally just comes back down? Or, in the short term, if we have a recession, if we have a good old-fashioned recession, that is deflationary. That will stop inflation temporarily. Once we then address the deflation or the recession, which all the central banks in the world are going to drop rates to zero, buy assets, print money, that's how they combat a deflationary, recessionary period. Well, once they do that, the inflation is going to ravage again. Because I think there's a changing world dynamic going on. We're not going to see our supply chains go back to the way they were pre-COVID. And the reason I say that is there's really been two major world dynamics happening that have sort of precipitated what we've seen for the past 25 years before COVID. The first one is with us in China. Essentially, we outsourced our manufacturing over to China. And what that gave us was cheap goods in a disinflationary environment. We didn't have to worry about inflation because our goods were getting cheaper all the time because we were sending it over to China. Well, what did China get out of this? Well, I mean, they stole our technology, so they've gotten a technological advantage out of it. But they've also gotten a trade surplus. So they have bringing in more goods than we send them. So that amount of money, that difference is a surplus for them. It's a deficit for us, surplus for them. That surplus is, we have basically, as the United States, have funded their military, have funded their expansion around the world with our trade surplus. So, but it's been working because we did it to get those cheap goods and the disinflation. And China loved it because they got technology and that surplus to help them expand. But clearly, we're not in that world anymore. There's certainly some issues with that. And it's going to manifest itself going forward. We're not going to have the same relationship we've had with China for the past 25 years. Now, on the other side of the Atlantic, we've got a similar situation with the European Union and Russia. Instead of cheap goods, what the European Union got was cheap energy. So they got cheap gas and oil from Russia. Russia got some technology and a trade surplus, which they at first were using to buy treasuries, but then the past 5 years or so, they've been buying just a ton of gold. This clearly isn't working anymore. I mean, this is very obvious that this thing's not going to happen due to what's happening in Ukraine. I don't know how this thing will play out, but the fact that they've already taken the Nord Stream down, whoever did that, it's not going to be feasible to just flip a switch and have the energy flow back into Europe from Russia. So we've got a serious problem there. Yeah, now you need that shot of Jack Daniels and probably a beer chaser. And what it's going to do is it's going to be a continual headwind for inflation, because we as a nation, as the United States, have got to do a few things now due to the changing dynamics in the world. First one is we're going to have to rearm to kind of defend the world order that we want. You can read about it, how the things we've already sent over to the Ukraine, we no longer have ammunition here in the U.S. for our soldiers, and we don't have any missiles right now. Everything's gone over there. We don't have the supply chains to have, a huge inventory of weapons, and it's horrible. We're going to have to do that. That's inflationary. We're going to have to reshore our manufacturing. Instead of offshoring to China, we are going to have to reshore it. And by reshoring, it's not going to be just using other countries like maybe Vietnam, the Philippines, Taiwan. We need to have a situation where our goods won't be blockaded by China, or our shipping passages won't be interrupted. So we're looking at having manufacturing either here in the United States or somewhere close that we don't have to rely on crossing the Pacific. So we're talking probably Central South America and Canada. Now, reshoring, bringing all this manufacturing back, is an enormous cost. It's very inflationary. All the new plants that have to be built, the training, the higher wages, all of that stuff is going to be inflationary for quite some time. Restocking and investing in commodities. Now, here's the thing. I've done presentations before showing that wind and solar just ain't going to cut it, man. Not in the near future. Probably never. We don't have the energy infrastructure that we've had even just a few years ago. We have undercut the amount of investment that we put into fossil fuels as well as nuclear, which are probably the only two areas that we really should be continuing to expand right now. So we have had an underinvestment in commodities, especially energy, and getting that back up and running is going to be costly. It's going to be inflationary. And if we can't, then just the higher demand and lower supply is going to be inflationary as it is. And it also gets back to rewiring the grid, making sure that we do make a transition to new energy sources. That's going to be expensive. So basically, what I think we're facing here, it really is going to be a big change to the economy. I think it's something that we're not going back to the pre-COVID days. Well, we're not going to see low interest rates again. We're not going to see lower inflation. We're not going to see the same kind of supply chain that we had before. And it's going to have an impact on the markets, especially considering that we're starting from extremely high valuations. Doesn't mean everything's going to collapse right now. I think it's one of those that plays out over time. Like I mentioned, central banks are going to try to, squeeze the balloon on each end in order to try to stymie a problem for a little bit until this one becomes a problem and go back and forth. But we're either going to be facing higher interest rates or higher inflation, without a doubt, because of that. And then as our unfunded liabilities and costs like that go, that's where we're going to really start to see some problems, not just for the United States, but for countries around the world. So I know this isn't really a touchy-feely topic. I'm sure it's not going to make you feel all that great. But I'm just trying to give you some perspective on, where I see things headed. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation. If you know anybody that like it, please share it with them. And I'm always looking for good ideas for presentations. Please feel free to reach out to me and let me know if you have something that's pressing on your mind.